It's lovely to have you all here. This is the first of our Spirituality, Theology and Health seminars for the new academic year. So welcome back. Welcome to those of you who are new. And it's a delight to be able to introduce this evening our speaker, Maggie Ross, about whom a little more in just a moment. As Harry was saying, the next seminar is on 24th of November. 10th of November, thank you. I can't remember anything for more than 1 minute. So the next seminar is on the 10th of November, and we're very fortunate to have Debbie Lightshett coming to speak. Debbie is a reader in nutrition at Coventry University, one of very few people in this country, or indeed in the world, who's interested in spirituality and nutrition. So that promises to be a very different kind of seminar than this evening, but also on a very unusual and much under-discussed topic. So do come along then. And obesity, what has God to do with it? Yeah, I remember the title. I can't remember trivia like dates and times, but I can remember the title. So come along then to hear Debbie talking about obesity. If you haven't already received the programme for the rest of the academic year, then please do let Harry know your email address and your name, and he'll add you to the list so that you get all the details about the seminars later in the year. We've got some very good speakers, and we're really pleased about that. So do come along and support them and support the group. So this evening, Maggie has asked that I should give as little introduction as possible, but some of you at least will be here because you'll know her from her published work. She has been based for quite some years now in Oxford in England, but she comes originally from the United States, and she's published extensively on spirituality, perhaps best known recently for Volume 1 of Silence, A User's Guide, and it's on the topic of silence that she's speaking to us this evening. So Maggie, thank you ever so much for joining us. We look forward to what you've got to say on the topic of silence.
The ambiguity in the title is deliberate. For we have to heal our perception and understanding of the process of silence before we can engage it as a way of healing. A lot of people today are afraid of silence. This fear is reflected in dictionary examples, which are almost entirely negative. She was silenced by a look. He put a silencer on the gun. The silence in the house was ominous. He was silenced by shunning. This impression needs to change, for silence is essential to a fulfilled and fulfilling life. Silence is not a material thing. It is a context and a process. Above all, it is an interior disposition. It is the matrix in which everything happens, from the dance of energy particles that create the illusion of materiality to the soft words spoken by a mother to her child. It is the source from which words, word, and music emerge and into which they disappear. Silence is not necessarily an absence of noise, although there are wilderness places that are so silent it feels as if you have lost your hearing. There are less extreme environments that could be called silent. For example, we might say that a forest is silent, but this silence includes the wind soughing through the branches, the rustlings of small animals in the underbrush, the sound of a running stream. And there is always the beating of our own hearts, the sound of blood pulsing in our ears. In whatever context, we need to remember that this sort of listening silence is our natural state. For most of human existence, human life has depended on silence. Silence that would help us be alert to predators, to invaders, to the subtle signals of weather changes through the action of temperature and humidity on the surface of the skin. This human awareness of silence as context is not dead in today's developed world. It is merely in abeyance. It is possible to take a group of the most urban and technologically addicted people into the Alaska wilderness and within hours, their sensitivity to silence as context and the messages it brings through their bodies will come alive again. But we are in danger of losing not only our last wild places, but also of destroying all habitable environment, precisely because our world is so full of noise that we cannot hear. There are a multitude of scientific studies that tell us how bad noise is for our physical and mental health. Yet we flee from silence, and noise levels only increase. Japan is one of the few countries that has done something concrete about this problem. It has identified and set aside 17 natural areas where stressed out urban dwellers can go and immerse themselves in therapeutic silence. Why is this sort of silence therapeutic? First, it allows all the energy-draining self-conscious constructs with which we present ourselves in the world to fall away, along with the anxieties and lust for control that generate such constructs in the first place. This movement is kenotic. It may seem completely involuntary, or it may be voluntary, a conscious letting go. Sometimes the relief afforded by entering such a silence is so profound that it almost seems like a kind of shock, a blissful shock as opposed to the other kind. Second, this letting go creates a metaphorical space, analogous to the verbal space at the bottom of the chiasmus of Philippians 2:5-11, the word therefore, in which we are open to the other part of our mind, the deep mind, in whose depths we behold the face of God, who speaks the word from silence, from whom we receive grace, theosis, and glory, the realization of our shared nature. Such fancy words for so simple a process. To move into silence is not necessarily linked to physical environment. It is available to us through a simple act of volition. I once knew a Mother Superior who sent her novices to Grand Central Station to learn to meditate. She thought if you could meditate there, you could meditate anywhere. This process of letting go self-consciousness into liminality is what I have called the work of silence, although the word work is misleading. The work is very much in the middle voice, an active passivity or receptivity. We actively turn away from noise in order to be receptive to silence, as in meditation. This liminal space affords the opportunity for us to be free from the chaotic chatter of our self-consciousness, to listen in a different key to a voice that sounds wisdom and insight from the deepest silence, which is that of the heart. If we work with silence long enough, the center from which we draw our energy shifts from the realm of the frenetic self-conscious mind to the well springs of the deep mind. The process bestows an interior stability, and in consequence, what we often perceive as the inside and the outside, interior silence and silence as context, reveal themselves to be a seamless whole. From this we can see it is not two problems that we face, external and internal environments, but rather a single problem that underlies much of what ails us today. If we can learn to live from the wellspring of silence, then insight becomes available to us to address practical difficulties we have created in the environment, such as noise pollution and climate change, and the diseases and social upheavals that are directly or indirectly exacerbated by the damage we have done that affects the health and well-being of every sentient creature on the planet. If silence is perhaps not what we might have expected, what then of healing? We often think of healing as making whole what was broken or diseased, but that is only a very small part of the story. Underlying this attitude towards healing is the assumption, a very dangerous assumption in my view, that we know what wholeness is. Of course, at one level, a very simple level, we can know. If a leg is broken, we know how it ought to be set and treated so that bone fragments will knit and form a union that may be stronger than the original. But at more subtle levels, what constitutes healing becomes a gray area, for every wounding leaves a trace. To ask, "Are you healed?" is like asking, "Are you happy?" Such questions are triggers for discontent, immediately bringing to mind all the ways in which we are not healed, or all the ways in which we are not happy. Furthermore, we have to take into account that we are mysteries to ourselves, in the same way that we can never know the experience of the other, or for that matter, the mind of God. It is rather through an eschatological openness that we come to understand the Trinitarian process that shows us that the unknowability, the mystery of ourselves, our neighbor, and God are the same mystery. And if the greater part of our relationships with ourselves, other, and God is unknowability or mystery, then it is presumptuous to assume we know what healing is, much less the meaning of dubious words such as closure. Let us return to the example above. The broken leg may be so badly shattered that it has to be amputated. In this case, physical healing can take place only through catastrophic loss in order to save the amputee's life. But even though amputation is itself deeply wounding, we hear amazing stories of the feats amputees have accomplished: climbing mountains, flying airplanes, trekking to the poles, competing in the Paralympics. But we have little notion of the terrible struggle these people may have undergone to receive the degree of mental healing and integration that underlie their extraordinary achievements, so that the double wounding itself has become the means of healing and growth. During the recent Paralympics, I was struck by the honesty of the athletes who, when asked, acknowledged that independent of cultural attitudes, the struggle to come to terms with disability never ends. But the healing shown by Paralympians is not the case for everyone. There are those for whom healing of any kind seems elusive, whose traumas are long-lasting and resistant to our sometimes facile ideas of closure and moving on. Too often there seems to be a cultural pressure on wounded people to hasten their grieving and to get on with life. Such attitudes may compound trauma and its aftermath, and further isolate those most in need of a sympathetic listening ear. For example, well-meaning therapists and counselors are only too ready to jump in to try to help immediately after a catastrophe such as a school shooting. Some of those involved may indeed be helped, but others who take events on board at a slower pace and at a deeper level may be left dangling months later when their condition is finally amenable to therapy. Having said this, we also need to be aware that continuing rehearsal of a trauma may groove it more deeply in the psyche, in part because it reinforces the narrative constructed by the self-conscious mind, which binds the person into their construct and obviates the possibility of healing that comes from self-forgetfulness. Healing seems to operate in the same way as grace. It happens not by a constant attention to and picking at scabs, but out of our sight when attention is turned elsewhere. I'm not, of course, talking about processes such as physical therapy, which demands focused attention while it is in process. But even here, the healing that is a consequence of the therapy happens out of sight in between the sessions, particularly during the silence of sleep. The point I'm trying to make here is that we must not presume to impose our ideas of what healing is on anyone, including ourselves. Just as we can never know another's experience, we can never know beyond the most general notions what healing may constitute for another person. Healing is a mystery that unfolds out of sight. Being silent, whether alone or with another person, may be the most effective context in which healing can take place. Talking may occur, but it is within the context of silence that the therapeutic process effects change. Prayer is a good example of what I'm talking about. Not the prayer of poor little talkative Christianity, but prayer beyond prayer, as Isaac of Nineveh calls it. We name our concerns before the God who is silence in order to realize what it is in ourselves or in our situation that needs healing, that we must let go of, so there is room for grace to work in the silence of unknowing. When grace works, and how it works, is none of our business. By contrast, we are much too eager to control the processes of the spiritual life, ours and those of others, because we are afraid of the greatest healing wound of all, death. And for some, letting go, control in silence, self-forgetfulness, seems a little too close to death, which of course is what it is, because silence demands the same sort of letting go as death, if not in the same degree. The paradox here is that we flee from the very process that can heal us, that we prefer to remain in sickness rather than risk letting go control the work of silence. We try to manage and domesticate trauma, which only magnifies the trauma. By contrast, there needs to be a willingness to allow one's involuntary vulnerability to become a chosen vulnerability, so that the healing that is beyond what we can ask or imagine is able to do its work in us. In fact, the mere willingness to make the choice is in itself a form of healing. Healing and loss are inextricably co-inherent. We have to be careful in speaking of the work of silence to distinguish it from trance, dissociation, and its desire for oblivion. All three of these are false paths that can be mistaken for silence. They are often present in the psyches of wounded people, but the good news is that through the work of silence, they can be converted to a positive solitude. For example, people who suffer abuse often take refuge in dissociation. The work of silence can show them that in the solitude of the deep mind, there is a reality, a spacious context, in which the untouched and inviolate part of themselves, their point vierge, can thrive in peace. Tibetan Buddhists say that while trance is in the realm of the gods, it is still on the wheel of samsara. Again, the work of silence through meditation can show a way to a calm alertness that displaces the immobility of trance. And the work of silence in any form is a counterpoise to the desire for oblivion. In this day and age, we cannot talk about silence without talking about ways into silence, particularly meditation. Meditation is one expression of the chosen vulnerability necessary to healing. However, meditation is not the only way into silence. Silence is in large measure a choice, and there are as many ways into silence as there are moments in the day. It can be as simple as noticing that your self-conscious mind is full of noise and, metaphorically speaking, turning away from that noise to reach into the luminous darkness of unknowing. If this simple exercise is done repeatedly, it can go a long way towards shifting the center from which a person draws their energy, from frenetic reification of self-consciousness to the well springs of the deep mind. Don't get me wrong, we need our self-consciousness to negotiate the ordinary tasks of living in the world, but it tends to wrap itself around us, and all we perceive is its own closed system. This simple exercise opens it to receive insight and direct perception from the deep mind, a process which is crucial for optimal living when the two minds work together in concert. Meditation, properly speaking, is a vexed topic, as is any traditional practice that has become popularized in the present day. It can be a way into silence and it can be therapeutic, but it cannot be done in isolation, in the sense that it cannot be compartmentalized, dissociated from ordinary life. Without being part of the focus of a whole life, meditation can become toxic. It will intensify whatever values one has or lacks. It is even possible to meditate in order to become a more efficient killer, as was the scene in the case of the Buddhist Navy Yard shooter of a few years ago in the USA. There is a misconception abroad that healing should feel good. In fact, the opposite is the case. Broken bones ache and skin itches when they are healing. In terms of meditation, thoughts can and inevitably do arise that are deeply disturbing. It is the unwillingness to open to and work with these thoughts that cause most people to abandon meditation. This should not surprise us because the way that meditation is taught in the West by Christian groups, or even by some Zen masters, can be deeply flawed. People are thrown into silence in a vacuum, as it were, so that when the cycle of thoughts begins to arise, there is no support and no guidance, no techniques available to help with the process, which is similar to the therapeutic cycle in talk therapy, when thoughts and images of the past that are traumatic arise, are looked at, become sources of insight, and then are integrated. There is often little mention of and or involvement of the body in many forms of Western meditation and talk therapy. It is no wonder that in Western versions of meditation, there are a number of people who crash and burn. By contrast, Tibetan Buddhist meditation includes both the body and attention to techniques to deal with the disturbing thoughts that arise and may even become obsessive. For example, not looking at the thought or its causes, but rather at the act of clinging involved in the obsession. Examining the thought comes later during insight meditation. The initiation to meditation in Tibetan Buddhism is strenuous. Advanced practices cannot be taught until the initiate has completed the non-dro, which is comprised of 440,000 separate exercises involving the whole person. There are 110,000 repetitions of each of prostrations, mantra offerings, mandala offerings, and guru yoga. Even before one begins the non-dro, there is a 2-week period of examining one's motives and the reasoning behind the practices. Permission and empowerment are required to progress further. These exercises and practices are done under the direction of a teacher who has been through the non-dro, at least one 4-year retreat, and who understands the permutations of consciousness. I am not suggesting that Tibetan Buddhism is without its casualties, distortions, or corruption. Every religion attracts unstable people who may come to grief or damage others. But I have seen fragile people flourish in a Tibetan Buddhist community who might be at risk in most other contexts. Christianity could learn a lot from Tibetan Buddhism in terms of its psychological approach to meditation. The particular Tibetan Buddhist community I'm thinking of is unique in my experience of communities, Christian, Buddhist, and otherwise. It is the most ostensibly laid-back and healing context I have ever experienced. Underneath the laid-back atmosphere, however, are people who are deeply serious about their practice. The community has a strong emphasis on silence. There is mandatory silence from 10 at night until 1 in the afternoon of the following day. There are people in the community who live in perpetual silence for extended periods, who live at peace among everyone else. Everyone in the community brings the silence of their own meditation to whatever they do as part of ordinary life, without any sort of ostentatious piety or preciousness. It is simply part of the atmosphere, the climate, which they live. Everything is low-key. Flaunting of religiosity is not only implicitly discouraged but non-existent. While there are formal interviews with the Lama when she visits, there are also always people available to talk to informally at other times. Beyond the silence, there are no mandated practices except for rotas for helping with housework and doing dishes. There are liturgies in the shrine room at least twice a day, but participating in them is optional. Members of the community are short-term or long-term, and not all of them are professed Buddhists. Like any community, this one can have its problems, and these are aired in meetings that usually resolve issues amicably. On the other hand, people who are acting disruptively or in a way that inflicts hurt on others are without hesitation spoken to or asked to leave. There are a number of reasons that this community provides such a therapeutic atmosphere. In the first place, there is the emphasis on silence. While there is often a lot of light-hearted laughter and joking, silence underlies everything. Second, there is an unspoken sense that this community has resources, that there is nothing that can arise in meditation or in community life that can't be dealt with, in the sense that someone will understand what is going on, who will know how and what to do if indeed anything needs doing. Discretion is paramount. Thirdly, there is a low-key but very genuine sense of welcome. Coming into this community is like sinking with a sigh of relief into a beloved old armchair. There is someone to orient an incomer to the practical aspects he or she needs to know, but far more important, there is an unspoken sense of being understood, that we are all in this together, which fosters a healthy self-forgetfulness. Fourthly, there is an integration of body through manual work and the availability of places to walk. All of these conditions lead to a sense of mystery and meaning in the ordinary, and it is these two factors, the consequence of self-forgetfulness, that are perhaps the most therapeutic of all. They are therapeutic for three reasons. They are open and require openness to be participated in. They are unspoken, beyond speech. And to engage them requires a kenotic movement, a dying to one's construct of self, to enter the fluidity of one's unfolding truth. Once again, healing comes through loss. As the poet Li Yong Li puts it, when we speak, we use outgoing breath, the dying breath, the exhaled breath, while the inhaled breath is the infeeding breath. So all human utterance is our dying breath articulated. Meaning is born as the breath dies, as we perish. The meaning of our lives is revealed, close quote. He reminds us that, quote, ancient Taoists believed that upon inhalation, our ego self becomes very inflated, while during exhalation, our sense of ego and body diminishes, and we become more open to a deeper, bigger presence, close quote. He believes that language, especially poetry, is inflected silence, in, quote, the way everything seems quieter after you hear a bell ringing. It is almost as if we're using language, but the real subject is silence. The silence is primal. I hope that after a line or stanza, there's a silence imparted to the reader, close quote. He continues, quote, the deepest possible silence is the silence of God. I feel a poem ultimately imparts silence. That way, it's again disillusioning. It disillusions us of our own small presence in order to reveal the presence of this deeper silence, this pregnant, primal, ancient, contemporary, and immanent silence, which is God, close quote. Healing means going through an apocalyptic experience in its literal meaning of unveiling or revealing. Here Lee is talking about poetry, but the principle applies to all of life. Quote, be still and know that I am God. That kind of stillness and silence. I think that a really good poem can impart a stillness which is God, which is also awe. I would say that disillusionment is revelation, and revelation is apocalypse, and every poem is apocalyptic. On the one hand, we have ecliptic things that hide, and on the other, we have apocalyptic things that reveal. The writing of poetry is writing that reveals, but doesn't reveal a personal presence. It reveals a transpersonal presence, and the characteristics of that presence are silent, stillness, and the saturation of presence. Close quote. If we are lucky, once or twice in our life, we will encounter someone who embodies these qualities of healing. I would now like to pick up on the ecological strand mentioned at the beginning of this paper, and to try to indicate how our relationship with the environment is key to our understanding of healing, especially through the little-known Christian tradition of the gift of tears. Before I embark on the gift of tears, however, I want to mention a book by Erazim Kohak, Kohak, The Embers and the Stars, a philosophical inquiry into the moral sense of nature, which is a profound meditation on the healing qualities of nature and how merely placing oneself in a landscape can lead to self-forgetfulness and transfiguration. But I want to talk now of tears. Weeping, grieving out our attachments, lust for power, and particularly our mortality, especially through manual work, is a major theme in patristic literature. One of the reasons the tradition of weeping is important is that at the bottom of tears is a vast healing silence, a space of opportunity, a tabula rasa that corresponds to that in the canonic hymn of Philippians 2, 5-11. The poet Edward Field describes it in his poem, A Journey. Quote, "He cried for a long time, but when he finally quieted down, a place in him that had been closed like a fist was open. He walked himself at last, a man among men, with such radiance that everyone looked up and wondered." Close quote. The gift of tears can change the appearance of a person, and it bestows a greater sensitivity to the environment. Isaac of Nineveh concurs. Some tears cause burning, others provide a kind of unction. All tears which flow out of compunction and anguish of heart as a result of sin dry up the body and burn it. And often when these tears are shed, a person will even feel that some harm has been done to his brain. A person will necessarily encounter this order of tears first of all. Then by them, the door leading to the second order will be opened for him, an order which is by far superior because it constitutes the sign of the receiving of mercy. What is this? The tears which pour forth as a result of some insight provide the body with a kind of unction. They flow spontaneously, and there is no compulsion in them. They anoint the body, and the appearance of the face is changed, for a joyful heart renders the body beautiful. Close quote. Most of all, the gift of tears bestows clear-eyed humility, the luminous perception of things exactly as they are, without which any remedies we might think of may be more perilous than remedial. Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaves of flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. Eden's grief is reflected in the ecological carnage that surrounds us. The pollution of the planet reflects the pollution of our souls, the detritus with which we litter our minds. We choke on interior noise and external consumption, and in consequence, the albatross chokes on a tuna hook, the sea turtle on a plastic bag, the curlew on contaminated mollusks. Such a baneful life adores only what it can devour and lives solely for the adrenaline rush of power over people and things. This toxic, phantasmagoric pseudo-world cannot bear silence, for silence reveals it for the delusion it is. It is this noisy world of deception and arrogance that the humble Christ defeats by self-emptying silence, refulgent with resurrection. The grief of Eden is the loss of the ability to behold. The first commandment, the first word that God speaks directly to Adam and Eve after completing the rest of creation and blessing them, is behold. To behold is all that God has ever asked of us. And as Irenaeus reminds us, we lost that ability when we became distracted from our primal beholding by the first conversation with the snake. We have been disoriented ever since. Our struggle, our divinely ordained task, is to learn once again to live a life of beholding, the real meaning of the word contemplation. And the way forward is through our grieving. The great apostle of the gift of tears is the 7th century bishop and solitary, Isaac of Nineveh. Isaac tells us that weeping is the only way, that when we learn to weep, we are opened into beholding, giving birth to the soul in the world to come. For Isaac and other early Syriac writers, the phrase "the world to come" does not mean pie in the sky by and by, but rather the resurrected life lived here and now. The return to Eden, where the angels with the flaming sword lower it in wonder at our tears and let us pass. Tears bring us to humility, the key to reestablishing beholding, especially our union with nature, to understanding that the environment is us, we who are made from the earth, embodying the freedom and glory of the children of God. Isaac tells us that, quote, "the humble person approaches beasts of prey, and as soon as their gaze alights upon him, their wildness is tamed, and they approach him and attach themselves to him as their master, wagging their tails and licking their hands and feet, for they smell from him the scent which wafted from Adam before his transgression, when the beasts gathered to him and he gave the names in paradise. The scent which was taken from us and given us back anew by Christ through his advent. For it is he who has made the smell of the human race sweet." What do we mean by union with nature? What is practical beholding? Gerald Durrell tells us, quote, "The first word I learned in Greenland was sila. It means simultaneously weather, the power of nature, and consciousness. For humans and animals that have co-evolved with ice and cold, there is no perceivable boundary between a knowing sentient being and the strong forces of weather. For such a culture, the notion of studying the mind as a discrete and objective entity in a laboratory, divorced from its natural context, would be considered laughable or crazy. Place names describe precisely the internal deep links among earth, ice, water, animal, wind, snow, and spirit, and cautionary tales that come from that commingling. Deep ecology in the Arctic means that the sound of the walruses' clicks and whistles, humming whales, and ululating songs of bearded seals rise through the kayak paddle. One's whole body becomes a listening post, receiving messages from under the ice. Animal and human minds are inextricably linked, and the ecological imagination arises from the forehead of each morning, shaped by cold and pushed into being by weather. Animal and human natures overlapped, intertwined, and were considered to be one and the same, as were animate and inanimate objects. A man could become an iceberg. A shaman could live as a bear, suckle 2 cubs, then return to being a shaman again. The outward forms differed, but not the essential nature. People and animals talked to each other, shared a common language, and changed skins on a whim." Close quote. This awareness has a profound effect on the way people comport themselves for the sake of the community, where the community is only as strong as the solitudes that make it up. And for the Inuit, lies and deceit are the same as murder. Accurate perception out on the ice depends on absolute honesty and free flow between 2 ways of knowing. If there is dominance by the talkative, deceitful, conceited, encapsulated, self-reflexive, self-conscious mind, it drowns out the perceptions of the deep mind and is usually fatal. Ehrlich again. To obtain awareness was once thought by the Inuit to be an essential aspect of personhood. The confines of the village in early times meant that behavior had to be moderate. Even-temperedness, humor, and modesty were highly valued. Cautionary tales warned people about the harm anger and self-pity could cause. Seeing was the ultimate act of the angakaks, or shamans. Whether it was seeing into the source of a famine or the source of an illness, they had to pierce all obstacles. In eastern Greenland and in Alaska, some shamans and their apprentices wore masks. Others hid their faces behind sealskins. In both cases, the idea was to banish the obstruction of the ego, greed, contempt, or self-importance that might get in the way. The neutrality of the face cover provided a passageway into another world. Close quote. The contrast here could not be more stark between the angakaks' masks of self-effacement and the carefully fashioned plastic personalities of today's celebrity gurus. While we can do nothing to bring back what has already been lost, we can at least learn compunction, and through compunction to live in a different way that we hope will be part of damage limitation. While no one would suggest that we should now imitate an indigenous way of life, although the need to do so will one day arrive, Native peoples still have a lot to teach us from what is left of their cultures, which survive in fragments in spite of Anglo-European efforts to annihilate them. The indigenous corollary of beholding is often translated as the word respect. Respect entails a deep engagement, a deep silence, a deep listening, a deep restraint. Restraint being a trait which Joseph Conrad described as a hallmark of civilization. And as Gretel Ehrlich's words tell us, a non-dual relationship with the natural world and with one another. The first step towards compunction and recovering the wisdom we Euro-Americans have lost is simply to shut up. Again, we need to remember that silence is our natural state. As noted above, for most of human existence, human life depended on the silence. Silence that would help us be alert to predators, to our surrounding context, to the subtle signals of weather changes through the action of temperature and humidity on the surface of the skin. But we need to realize that instead we are now like the epileptic child in Mark 9, who writhes first in fire and then in water, whose noisy demon can be cast out only by prayer. If we can realize this insight, then perhaps we can take the first step in understanding that all life is prayer. It may be positive prayer or negative prayer, but every moment of our lives we are prayer, whether we are aware of it or not, whether we will admit to it or not. And awareness is not always self-conscious. Silence is always available underneath the noise, even our interior noise, which is only the static of ephemeral thoughts. The prayer we are conscious of praying is a clearing out of our works and ways. We name them so that we can release ourselves from their limitations and come into the open space of opportunity, the intercession, where God can act on and through us. Weeping is often a sign of this emptying out, the relinquishing of our efforts to control the future in God. It is the sign of transfiguration, of shifting perspective, of new creation. In this density of holiness, we are raised out of time to that primordial silence in which all expansion, all possibility are held in potent stillness, as our tears mingle and ignite with that single certain drop from the abyss. Tears are our body's participation in theosis. In these tears we see the beginning of the transfiguration of all creation that will be accomplished by Christ in and through us. Tears are the refiner's fire. Tears are the sorrow caught in beauty and joy. Tears are the mirroring of the consuming fire who weeps. Tears break open our stony hearts. They become alabaster boxes from which the oil of the Spirit's anointing is poured on the earth. We begin to understand that our tears, like the water Elijah poured on the altar, ignite the baptism of fire which Christ has promised, salting creation with fire which breaks out from all things. Our only security is the insecurity of listening in unknowing and then acting in faith on what is heard and given. Our prayer is being prayed. Our only perception is non-experience. We must realize that not only is there no aspect of our lives that is not ecological, there is no part of our lives that is not theological, and there is no theology without praxis. To realize the ecology of the mind is to realize the ecology of the mind's journey into God, and the interdependence of our ensouled bodies with all sentient bodies on earth. And that ecology is a universe made of love, in which each creature, each landscape, each star and black hole and galaxy is a density that gathers and intensifies glory. The deepest form of prayer is simply to open ourselves and offer God the life given us, to do this wordlessly in silence and stillness, in adoration, not knowing and not wanting to know for what purposes our life might be used by grace, or what consequences, if any, there might be. Intercession allows a space for something to be worked out, we know not how. It tears a hole in the imprisoning membrane of our thoughts and fears, so that the rain of salvation may fall on us. And when we have been denuded of our ideas of how the world should be, or even what the problem is, and enter this space of intercession, we find to our wonder and joy that we are wearing the robe of glory of our original nakedness, signing the world with the full potential of Eden. In this vast and fertile wilderness, we offer the life we share with God, and we wait on that loving kindness in a silence that is both end and beginning, our source and our home. So what then is healing? I would like to suggest that if healing is to occur, we don't know and can't know what it is. To be sure, some physical wounds are predictable in their cycle of protocols for healing, but I'm talking about emotional, intellectual, and spiritual healing. In these cases, healing is often inadvertent. We frequently misidentify it while it's happening. We recognize it in retrospect, and even then we cannot articulate what it is. I would suggest that the healing process is a gratuitous inbreaking of wholeness that never ends, and that a willing openness to meaning and mystery in silence and unknowing, like the eschatological humility on which they are dependent, are something divine and incomprehensible, the keys to understanding and living through our wounds into a wholeness that we can never grasp. Thank you.
Thank you.